but we will start with House File 2314. That's the bill we held over from yesterday. We have a few folks who would like to testify. So when we have a quorum, I will move House File 2314. And members, I do believe I have an amendment. I will be moving the A1 amendment to get the bill in shape I like when we have a quorum. If Mr. Michael could briefly describe the bill.
Let's see, are we on the tax credit for prepared?
Yes, sir, okay. 2314.
Mr. Chairman, members of the committee, House File 2314 with the author's amendment provides a non-refundable 20% tax credit for charitable donations of prepared food that's donated by businesses that are regularly in the business of selling prepared food. So essentially that would include, and this is what the amendment does, the original bill was limited to restaurants, and the amendment expands it to other businesses that are in the business of selling prepared food. So that would include, for example, grocery stores and other entities that the original bill required 70% of their gross receipts to be from selling prepared food, whereas the amendment eliminates that and allows it to all businesses. So essentially this is donations of meals and similar amounts that they would get a tax credit, as opposed to the under current law where they get a deduction for those contributions. That deduction would be added back, so they would just get the 20% tax credit. And again, it's non-refundable with no carry forward.
Thank you. We do have a quorum. I'll officially call the meeting of the House Tax Committee to order. Representative Simonson moves the minutes of March 24th, 2016. Any additions or corrections? All in favor say aye.
Aye.
Opposed? Motion prevails. Representative Simonson moves the minutes of March 29th. You weren't actually here. Representative Simonson moves the minutes of March 29th. Any additions or corrections? All in favor say aye.
Aye.
Opposed? Motion prevails. Thank you, Representative Simonson. Item next, I will move House File 2314. I will now move the A1 amendment, and Mr. Michael described the bill as amended. Any further discussion on the amendment? All in favor say aye. Opposed? Motion prevails. Thank you, members. Okay, we have House File 2314 before us. It's been described. Is there anyone, Mr. McElroy, I believe, would like to make a few comments? Is there anyone else in the audience that wish to testify on behalf of the bill or with concerns thereof? And there is a letter in the packet from the Minnesota Grocers Association members dated March 29th. Please state your name and who you represent for the record, please, sir.
Thank you, Mr. Chair and members. My name is Dan McElroy. I'm Executive Vice President of the Minnesota Restaurant Association and the Minnesota Lodging Association. Our associations have about 2,300 member locations in Minnesota, of whom we believe something over 300 currently have active programs for donating prepared food to charities that see that those foods are used to serve people who have need for them. Work closely with a variety of entities, including the Salvation Army and others. When I ask our members why they may not yet participate in prepared food donation, some of them because they're busy and have small staffs and haven't gotten to it. Others because there are some costs involved with those donations of additional storage space, of staff training, of containers in some cases, of transportation in some cases. And we applaud this bill, Mr. Chair, and its efforts to address that. And we see it as a win for our restaurant and full-service hotel members, for the nonprofits who are the conduit for this prepared food, for the environment because we avoid waste and we avoid the energy use of cooking food twice or cooking food that's never used, and for the individuals and families who benefit from a nutritious meal. So we thank the members for their support of this bill and urge that it be laid over for inclusion in the omnibus tax bill, Mr. Chair. Thank you very much.
And thank you, Mr. McElroy. Members, if you think about what this bill does as amended, this could help a lot of food shows, could help a lot of people. I've always been very supportive of local food shows, and I think this is a good thing to do. Mr. Michael, does this, with the amendment, does this include gas station food?
Mr. Chairman, one of the requirements of the bill is that if you look on page 7, lines 12 through 15 is those are the requirements for the food that qualifies, and I'll leave it to the committee to decide whether or not that includes gas station food or not.
Thank you,
Mr. Chairman?
Michael, I love gas station food. Mr. McElroy.
Mr. Chairman, as we've discussed this with some of our members who, not so much gas stations, but limited service hotels, those types of food from companies like Deli Express or Supermoms or others are often heated and prepared early in the day, but there's rarely leftovers because they're very careful about not having too much left at the end of the day. So we don't think that's where the volume will come from. One of the big volume areas is weddings, where a wedding venue will prepare for whatever the guarantee was plus 10%, and depending on how many people show up, there may be prepared meals left. Events at hotels create prepared food. Some restaurant menu items create prepared food that is available for donation. Short order kinds of things or heat to order are less likely to result in donations, Mr. Chair.
Thank you. Just a note for members here, to be clear, I have from House Fiscal here, the revenue estimate is on the base bill itself, not with the amendment. So we're not voting this out of here today, so we can get members some new numbers as soon as they're available. With that, if you could please state your name and who you represent for the record, please, sir.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Jim Erickson, representing QSR Plus, Quick Service Restaurant Plus, sometimes known as fast casual, sometimes known as fast food. Our members include Burger King, Taco Bell, Jimmy John's, Subway, Dairy Queen, and we represent, my client group represents some 177 locations in the state of Minnesota, all operated by franchisees. This bill was brought to us by Yum Brands, which is the national brand owner of Taco Bell. They are pursuing this in this state and in Arizona, California, Georgia, Kentucky, Massachusetts, New York, Texas, Washington, or West Virginia. So we'd appreciate you being the first in the states to do this. I might add that, as you know, Mr. Chairman, Senator Rest is your co-author in the Senate. The bill was heard in the Senate, very favorably reviewed, and laid over for possible inclusion in their bill. So we're here to support it. We think it's a good bill. I appreciate the chance every now and then to appear on behalf of a white hat bill, and that's what this is. So I'm here to support Mr. McElroy and the Restaurant Association and represent my group and stand for certainly any questions, but thank the committee and for considering it, and thank you, Mr. Chairman, for carrying the bill.
Thank you very much. You say you represent Jimmy John's?
They are one of our members, yes, sir.
Freaky fast. Freaky fast. I love Jimmy John's. Okay, I love them all. I'm just feeling the love today. Chair Carlson.
Yeah, Mr. Chairman, I certainly agree with the thrust of the bill. I used to serve on a board, and we provided a number of services locally, including a food shelf. And we had some wholesale grocers that were willing to donate out in the western suburbs. And my question then is prepared food. As I read this, I'm not sure it's totally clear that, let's say, a wholesale grocer, if they donated some flour or sugar, obviously that would take some preparation. But what if they donated canned goods that simply had to be heated? Soup, for example, or cookies that you don't even have to heat, they're prepared to be consumed. And so I'm just kind of going at the definition after Mr. Michael pointed out those lines on page 7, if that would include, and I guess I said wholesale grocers because there was one in particular that was a big donor, but that could be grocery stores, that are donating those same kinds of items to a local food shelf. Just wondering if they're covered.
Mr. Michael?
Mr. Chairman, Representative Carlson, I don't think that that's not intended to be covered, because if you look at lines 12 on page 7, it says food which is cooked or heated by the qualifying taxpayer. And in the case of making a donation of a bag of flour, that's not something that the grocer cooked or heated. Now, on the other hand, if the grocer baked the cookies and donated them, I suppose that might qualify, because then they were, then there are 2 or more mixed ingredients, and they were, baked. That's, I assume, means the same thing as cooked or heated. And so that probably would qualify in your example.
Sure.
Yeah, and that's what I was trying to get a clarification. I understood that things like flour, sugar would require some mixing or cooking. They wouldn't qualify, but when I was on that board, quite frankly, a lot of donations were canned goods, and they would be mixed. They would simply require you to open the can and heat the soup or whatever the other, basically what I would describe as prepared food. I don't remember if we got much frozen food, but they had big freezers where we were storing the food, for clients that would come in. So they may even have gotten some frozen prepared foods from grocery stores and some of the wholesalers. But I was just interested in some clarification because I like the direction of the bill. And really, it was those kinds of donations that helped immensely with the local food shelf that we were operating.
Thank you, Chair Carlson. The gentleman from Lyon.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. My question just kind of goes, we talked a little bit about what you can do. This bill is obviously moving forward to try to encourage donations. How about from a liability standpoint, whenever you're dealing with prepared food and the donation of it, how does that process work out through obviously that's not, maybe above and beyond the tax committee here, but that was a question that I had and thought since you're there, it'd be
Mr. McElroy?
Mr. Chairman, one of the reasons there's some cost involved is the necessary to maintain records that it was kept at temperature, chilled properly, kept in coolers, usually not donated hot, usually chilled for safe transportation. But our members potentially have liability and have insurance for that. There is some provision in the health code that if we follow all the rules in the Minnesota Food Code, we have some safe harbor, but we're liable potentially.
Mr. Chairman.
Mr. Erickson, I'm sorry.
Mr. Chairman, Representative, I might add that for my particular quick service restaurants, we are very cognizant of the liability issue, and we have procedures in place to make sure that the product we're donating is safe, healthy, not spoiled, and efficacious. So the point is well taken. We're willing to take that risk to help move the ball forward in terms of the donation that is being encouraged by this bill. And I might just say, I've heard it alleged that if we did not throw away all the food in just the U.S. that gets thrown away, we'd feed the world. So this is a modest step to try and alleviate that and encourage food to be used if it isn't used in its first purpose. Thank you.
Gentleman from Lyon.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. And this question maybe would go to Mr. Michael, but looking at kind of the sales tax collection, if you're dealing with prepared food from like a wedding, or say you were preparing for 350 people and 300 showed up, you'd be potentially donating 75 meals. If you're the end user, if you're the wedding party, you'd essentially have paid sales tax on the lot of 400 some meals. Is there have you guys looked at as an organization from a sales tax relief standpoint that's saying, hey, if you do order that many meals and paying sales tax collection, but then, because I know we had a bill, I think it was last year, looking at with restaurants and meals and sales tax on meals for potential employees and some of those things, and trying to work some of that out and how those two things would potentially jive together. Thank you.
Mr. McElroy.
Mr. Chairman, That is not a part of this bill. We have not looked at it. It is an interesting idea. If a family guarantees or a purchaser guarantees a certain number of meals, they're charged for that. In order to avoid embarrassing a host, most meeting venues, wedding venues particularly, will prepare a little over that so they're protected if more people show up. There was no sales tax charged on that portion of it. But there is on paid, guaranteed, not served. We're not proposing that that be refunded, but it's an interesting idea, and we'll look at it. It's not something we've been asked about.
Most weddings I go to, if there's extra food, by the time I leave, there's not a whole lot left. Mr. Michael, I believe the gentleman from Lyon brings up a very good question in that, didn't we pass a couple of years ago a provision, a kind of a Good Samaritan thing, where if you donate to food shelves, your liability is somewhat lessened?
Mr. Chairman, I think what you're referring to is conforming to the federal treatment of the donation of food, that there's a special, under normal circumstance, if you're in a business and you donate your inventory, your stock and trade, you get a deduction that's limited to the amount of your cost as opposed to the fair market value of the donation. There's a special federal rule that's been part of the expiring tax provisions that I know you carried a separate bill on to conform to that provision the last time around, which of course the legislature did. Congress now has made that provision permanent, and if your federal conformity bill were to pass, that provision then would become a permanent part of the Minnesota tax code.
Thank you, Mr. Michael. Representative Chair Earhart.
Well, Mr. Chairman and others, I still remain in doubt about the ability, when I read page 7 about prepared foods and so forth, I can see people, not any restaurant people that you represent, but people building up their charitable deduction by what they're shipping out to wherever they're shipping it out to. Frankly, I've seen a lot of stuff that I know is not marketable due to appearance, age, freshness, grade, size, surplus, or other conditions, and so forth, shuffled off to somewhere else where it can be eaten. And I don't know if that's, now we're going to give a charitable deduction for that. I don't know. I get a little queasy when I think of the stuff I've seen. Frankly.
Mr. McElroy?
Mr. Chairman, I can't speak to what may happen in some areas. I know the organizations that my members work with, like Salvation Army or the National Food Connection, are very careful about the charities that they work with and the processes and procedures for it being used in a reputable manner. Those are the people who would apply for this credit. I'm not aware of the situations that Representative Earhart refers to. The liability for sending anywhere food that may not be safe and wholesome to eat is pretty high, and I know our members wouldn't do that. It isn't worth the risk.
Chair Earhart?
Mr. Chairman, does this apply only to the restaurants that he represents, or does it apply to everybody across the state?
Mr. McElroy?
Mr. Chairman, it would apply to anyone who's licensed as a restaurant or under the amendment, a food service operator. They're all subject to inspection by the U.S. or Minnesota Department of Health, some by local health inspection. The Minnesota Food Code speaks to not allowing food which isn't fit for human consumption to be served or passed along to where it would be served. I don't think this bill impacts whether some inappropriate practices may continue, but the bill does apply to anyone who qualifies under the terms of the bill.
Chair Earhart? Okay, and members, or maybe for Mr. Michael, on page 7.14, I don't know if we need to change the word "or" to "and," because it says ingestion or chewing. Why would you ingest if you haven't chewed? I mean...
Liquid.
Smoothie?
Soup.
Oh, a smoothie. Okay, you wouldn't chew that, I hope. Teeth would be very sensitive. Okay, Representative Wills.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. I had a few different questions. And one of my questions was about an and, but a little higher up on line 7.13, where it's listing the criteria by which the food would need to qualify. And the word and is used. And I guess I'm just not sure if it would be appropriate to change it to the word or, because the first line of that section where it says food which is cooked or heated, would that exclude any, say, like a coleslaw or something where it's never heated? So I could see how that would make it problematic. And then wondering also if this would affect schools with the extra food that they have left over, because there's a lot of waste in schools, especially with the federal requirements that they provide certain portions. And then third question, how would the amendment affect the revenue note if we're broadening from restaurant to individual or entity? Sorry, that was a lot of questions all in one.
Wills, by broadening, the amendment broadens the scope, so there would be more cost, and we will get those numbers as soon as we can. Mr. Michael, on 7.13, should the and be an or?
No.
Michael?
Mr. Chairman, it depends upon whether you want to have all of those requirements apply to anything that's going to be donated or not. If you don't, if you want to, I think Representative Wills makes a good point that if you want to allow food that has never been heated to qualify, you would need to make that an or. So that, I think that, it's a policy question as to exactly what you want to I think the people who put the bill together are the restaurant people, and they do. All of the food they donate has been heated in some way. It's, more than it's, yeah. So.
Okay.
Or they're in that business.
Representative Wills? Or Mr. McElroy?
We can work with the bill whichever way it passes. What I hear about is generally not coleslaw, but it is entrees or large volume side dishes. But I can understand the point, and Mr. Chair, we can work with it either way you choose to pass it.
Okay, thank you. Representative Wills?
Thank you, Mr. Chair. And I would recommend changing it to an or, just to clear up any confusion in interpreting it by the entities that would qualify. But, Mr. Chair, it's your bill, so it's your decision. And then wondering if we have an answer on how this would affect schools, if at all, because...
Well, I think Mr. McElroy's suggestion is good. Let's talk about this, because you bring up a very good point here. If that's okay, we'll, as this thing gets discussed further. Representative Loeffler?
Well, thank you, Mr. Chair, and I'm disappointed that we don't have anyone from the receiving side here testifying, because I've heard of challenges that they face. It's late in the day, you're not going to sell as much as you cooked. All of a sudden, you want to drive it down to the shelter downtown. And they don't have storage facilities, they don't have staff at that time of day to package it up or to put it, may not have space in a cooler, we'll have to, heat up and then figure, it can be a challenge for the receiver, depending upon their relationship, and this sort of implies that, and I'm wondering whether or not they're going to have some bookkeeping responsibilities. Typically when you donate something, you have to give a receipt that says what you received on what day, whatever. Typically restaurants run out of food late in the day, which is when they typically would have an overnight staff person with supervision, maybe a security person, but not people prepared to deal with taking in food. In the food shelves, I have heard from food shelves in my city that have had to incur increased costs because people are donating, or businesses are donating produce that is, maybe good stuff is mixed in with stuff that's going. Or is certainly not the food that most people would pick on their own because of its size or its condition. And on line 7.14, 1.0, you say that food may not be readily marketable due to appearance, age, freshness, grade, size, or other conditions. And, this sort of implies that it's okay for people who are the working poor, who are stretching things by going to a food shelf, should just take, something that's unattractive and about to expire. And they've actually, some of the food shelves have incurred significant composting charges if they're responsible. They compost rather than just have it hauled out as trash, and they have to have a lot of volunteer recruitment to just sort through the stuff and pull out the bad things and, put the things that are in good condition out for the people who are receiving it. And so I'd really like to hear from the other side of this. I always support people supporting our food shelves and our soup kitchens, but we don't want to create more work for them just to give a tax break to someone who has some excess material. And maybe they have to have an advance written agreement before they, that specifies the terms of the donation or something like that, so that they know that it will be delivered the next day, the next morning, when per an agreement or something like that.
Thank you. Mr. Erickson, to the Loeffler point.
Mr. Chair, Representative, some of my clients are already participating in doing some of this without the incentive. What we want to do is encourage and help cover some of their costs and encourage more people to do it. But it's a two-way street, Representative. We can't donate to someone that doesn't accept it. I mean, we don't go in and dump some product and then take a donation. It's in some cases, a contractual relationship. We're going to bring you this, and if you accept it, that's fine. So I think the protection to what you're concerned about, Representative, would be that the receiving party is doing that with its eyes wide open and getting value for what they're getting. And if they don't, they'd say no, and we wouldn't be entitled to the deduction. I think it's if not contractual, certainly a consensual two-party agreement that happens regularly. That's my understanding, and I think we would, if there are problems in that, we'd certainly work on it in the future. And certainly, Representative, we can reach out to some of the folks that we do give money to now that can weigh in on your question. And I'll be happy to do that as the bill goes forward, Mr. Chair.
And I think Representative Loeffler brings up a very valid point, and I think what I'm going to do is I will reach out to Channel 1, some of the food shelf folks, to see what they think of this bill, and I haven't at this point. But I will write that down so we don't forget. Please. Sounds so bossy, sorry.
Thank you, Mr. Chair.
Representative Loeffler.
Thank you, Mr. Chair, because I think that the food shelves and the homeless shelters are in a precarious position because they're dependent upon charitable donations of cash, quite honestly, for their operations, which might come from these businesses. And so they tend to accept what comes and bear the burden, I think, not to create waves, I will just say. They're in a position where, they're trying to do the best for people in their community who are struggling. And I don't know that they want to publicize that how much they end up having to dispose of and compost because they either don't feel it's safe, or it hasn't been stored safely, or wasn't delivered at the right temperature, or because it really is past the point that most people would feel it was comfortable food to serve their family.
Thank you, Representative Loeffler. Representative Petersburg.
Thank you, Mr. Chair, and I can somewhat speak to that too, because I think you're absolutely right, Representative Loeffler. There is some concerns and questions there. As a church administrator, we are one of the recipients of this type of donation that has been done in the past, and it can create a problem. The option that we have is we always can turn down the donation. And sometimes we have to do that, but we get things like Little Caesars that does their pizzas on pretty much on demand. At the end of the day, sometimes they are left over, and they are sent to us for giving out with our Wildcat Pantry, in which we give that out to individuals, and we do need to provide volunteers for that, but we know in advance that those things generally are occurring, and most of the time there is a relationship between organizations of that nature, and so I really do appreciate the ability for us to be able to get the food in the hands of people that want and need that extra food. And yeah, every once in a while there is some loss. Bread, for example, is one of those things that only lasts for so long, and so we try to give it out during the week, but at the end of the week it sometimes is not the proper place for that. But we accept that as part of our cost of maintaining our relationship with the people that need the food. And so for at least the churches, which are also one of the participants in this program, it's working fairly well at this point. In talking with food shelves, they sometimes do have to deny donations as well. And so I think that's a question that we have.
Thank you, Representative Peters. But Chair Carlson.
Yeah, Mr. Chairman, I've got a comment, but when he mentioned bread, it made me think of something that is an aside from what my real comment will be. But I still remember my brother got a job at a local grocery store. I won't name it because it still exists, and he's a senior citizen now, so it's a long time ago. But my parents were products of the Depression, so you didn't waste food. And he came home and he had this new job at this grocery store. And part of his task was to clean the shelves of all the baked goods and burn them. They wouldn't even let the employees take a loaf of bread home or whatever. And my parents, they couldn't hardly believe it, because products of the Depression, you just didn't waste anything, especially food. But what I was going to suggest, Mr. Chairman, the reason I really had my hand up was that very section. I had highlighted what two members have brought up there, even though the food may not be readily marketable and so on. I was going to suggest that the author of the bill, Mr. Chairman, might consider putting a period before the even though, and then just say prepared food means food that meets all qualifying and labeling standards imposed by federal, state, and local laws and regulations, period. I think that would get at the issue that Representative Earhart brought up, Representative Loeffler brought up, and that I had highlighted and was planning on bringing up. And I'm not going to propose it as an amendment unless the chair perceived it as a friendly suggestion.
Well, thank you, Mr. Chair, and maybe Mr. McElroy or Mr. Erickson, you could comment, because I think Chair Carlson brings up a very good point, that why did I put that in my bill where it says, even though food may not be readily marketable due to appearance, age, freshness, grade, size, surplus, or other conditions, if it doesn't qualify for anything, why would we be giving that away?
Mr. Chairman, we'd have no objection to Representative Carlson's proposal. In fact, I think it is a good idea. We can only lawfully donate things that meet the food code and that meet the standards, and you cover that in the first part of the sentence. The reason it's in the bill that we provided is it was in a model act that's been considered in Minnesota, in other states. It's not unusual for Minnesota to do it a little better, Mr. Chairman.
Chair Carlson, what you're suggesting is on 7.9, a period after regulation.
And then remove the rest of that sentence. Would be my suggestion.
It'd be on 7.9, it'd be regulations, comma, and then you go down, delete everything to, but include and includes.
Yeah.
Mr. Michael?
That would make it workable, Mr. Chairman.
Mr. Chairman, that's correct. Essentially, the amendment would be on page 7, line 9, delete even though the food may not, and then on delete line 10, and on line 11, delete conditions, comma.
No, I think that's a great idea, Chair
Chairman, I'll
Carlson.
move the amendment.
Chair Carlson moves the amendment. We're aware of the amendment on 7.9 as Mr. Michael just stated. Any discussion? Hearing none, all in favor say aye.
Aye.
Opposed? Motion prevails. Thank you, Chair Carlson. I think that's good. Very good. Okay. Other discussion or questions for Mr. Erickson or Mr. McElroy? With that, I will move that House File 2314 as amended be later for possible inclusion in an omnibus tax bill. All in favor say aye.
Aye.
Opposed? Motion prevails. Thank you, members.